You're listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Joanna Kyriazis. She serves as the Director of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada, a climate and clean energy think tank at Simon Fraser University. Thanks for joining me, Joanna.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so today we're talking about EVs primarily, but also just, the affordable green economy as a concept in general. And I thought, who better to have on than my old friend? And when I say old friend, I think you're probably the person I've known longest of anyone I've had on this podcast, because of course we have known each other since we were, 10 years old. So we go quite a ways back. So I'm really glad you're here today. Before we sort of really get into it, I want to talk about where you work, because you do some really interesting work and some really important work. You're over at Clean Energy Canada, which is a think tank out of Simon Fraser University. Can you talk about what you and your colleagues do every day in terms of this kind of work around the green economy?
Yeah, absolutely. So my team at Clean Energy Canada, we work to advance the clean energy transition in Canada. We work at the federal and provincial levels mostly, although sometimes engage municipally. And we do a range of policy research and analysis, a lot of public opinion polling, and engaging with Canadians to see where they're at, what's resonating with them. And then we advocate for solutions with government, often in conjunction with industry, because we want to make sure the policy solutions we're putting forward work for everyday Canadians, as well as the industries that are making up, a growing portion of Canada's economy.
I want to talk about EVs. So, before we hit record, we were talking about how you've been writing a lot about this topic. It's something that, I follow anything you write anyway, but it's something that has struck some interest in me, because this conversation is really top of mind, has been top of mind, I would say, for the last, 10 to 15 years, but especially even in the last few weeks. It's been something that's been a big issue as we start talking about this like Build Canada agenda and our mining agenda and all these other pieces. So 25%, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the last stat I saw was 25% of Canada's emissions comes from road transportation. So it's an enormous chunk of what we actually emit out into our environment and how we shape our climate as a country. This is despite the fact, again, that fuel efficiency standards have gone up over time, but it's the fact that there's just more and more personal vehicles hitting the road. Not just personal vehicles, of course, we also have, like every time you order from Amazon or whatever it is, there's a truck rolling down the road as well. So there's a lot of different impacts that, you as an individual consumer and person have when it comes to road transportation. So given all that, how important is it for our society to make the shift to electric vehicles, and how can that help reduce, our climate footprint?
Yeah, so you're right. Transportation is the second highest polluting sector in Canada. It's nearly tied with the oil and gas sector. And in provinces like BC and Ontario that don't have oil and gas sectors, it's the highest. And I think it's easy to assume that a lot of those carbon emissions come from the big vehicles, the heavy duty trucks, the airplanes, the ships, but half of all transportation emissions in Canada come from personal transportation. So the cars and the trucks that we drive. We have had regulations that work to improve the fuel efficiency of these vehicles year after year, and they have been, working to some degree, but certainly, they're not doing enough. And that's particularly as Canadians have made a pretty drastic shift in the types of cars that we drive, where 20 years ago, about 80% of new personal vehicle sales were smaller cars, and hatchback sedans. Now 80% of them are larger pickup trucks and SUVs, which are much more polluting. The Ford F-150 has been the top selling vehicle in Canada for years. So that shift to larger vehicles has actually canceled out a lot of the emission reduction gains that we've made from those fuel efficiency standards. And that's where electric vehicles come in. We need to be making sure that all new vehicles, from the smaller hatchbacks to the larger pickup trucks, are electric. EVs produce no tailpipe pollution, and especially when you're plugging into Canada's electricity grid, which is over 80% clean, they end up being one of the best ways that we can cut carbon pollution in the vehicles that we drive.
I want to ask about vehicle choices because, I live in Midtown Toronto, and pretty much every vehicle you see is an SUV, is a big truck. Now, some people do use trucks for work purposes, but a lot of people in downtown Toronto do not, and it is a style thing. I will give caveats to, like, people are bigger now and taller, and you need more, cab space and whatever it is. And maybe we can have a conversation with car manufacturers about that so that, it's easy to get in and out of all that kind of stuff. But to your point, there are a lot more of these really big vehicles on the road now. And I think I did see an article like a couple of days ago about how we basically, what you were just saying, wiped out emissions gains that we had been making because of our personal vehicle choices. So, a lot of stuff around climate is, well, it's mostly like big industry polluting. And, while true, each of us as individuals actually can make an impact on this. So I want to talk just really, really briefly about some of these options. For EV vehicles, like, I think there are some trucks and stuff, but like, is there a barrier in people's preferences for being able to change some of these bigger vehicles over to EV? Have you seen, like, is this something that people who drive those vehicles they don't want an EV at all, or they're like, oh, like, as far as I'll go is hybrid, or is there space to sort of move into those markets as well with this technology?
Absolutely, there's space. And actually, car maker, one of the problems is that car makers are kind of over focusing on these larger, more luxury vehicles because they are way more expensive, even in electrification efforts. So if you look at what's on offer in Canada today, we do have, electric SUVs like the Ioniq 5 or like the Kia EV6. General Motors used to offer a smaller EV, the Chevy Bolt, which was the, second or third top selling EV in Canada, but canceled that vehicle or discontinued that vehicle and is now focusing on larger versions like the Chevy Equinox or the Chevy Silverado. And so there are electrification efforts happening in the SUV and pickup truck space, but they're more expensive. And I think we're going to get into that topic today, where Canada really has an EV affordability problem, where there's a gap in the market for those younger Canadians who maybe can't afford, a $60,000 car, or for urban Canadians who don't want to struggle to park, a large electric F-150 in city streets.
I think it's not even the size. Like, I don't want to park at all.
Yeah, same.
Like, these are tight streets. I live off of a street with a streetcar, a dedicated streetcar right down it. Like, no, I don't want to be parking. Like, yeah, it is difficult to, I think you're right. Want to invest in something like that if you're only be driving part-time. Like, there's a number of parking lots around me where you just have cars with their tires completely deflated because it's just too expensive to drive in general. So then imagine trying to pay out for something really, really expensive like that. We're going to talk more about affordability going down the road, but I do want to talk about the political shift. So we were talking about politics quite a bit before we hit record here. And something that's been really interesting to me as a, political practitioner to watch is the shift in recent years towards this kind of technology. So we know electric vehicles have existed for, a century at this point. This is not the technology we use now is new, but like the lineage of it goes way, 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 way back to, the earliest cars. Like, we actually had electric vehicles before we had gas powered vehicles. So that's an interesting thing. Then you see, I'm sure you've watched like Who Killed the Electric Car when you were in university, because that was a popular film at the time. And this was something that, in the 90s, early 2000s, there was an electric vehicle market that really crashed because the oil and gas sector wanted it to crash. So we have now rebounded a bit where people are actually interested in this space, in making money off of this side of car making. But I think the biggest push is that even, your most conservative political actors now understand that there is an entire industry that can be bolstered here, that this is where the technology is going anyway, but mostly that you can actually bolster your mining sector and your resource extraction sectors and create jobs through, traditional industries that, more conservative politicians will typically look at in order to actually get these other sectors up and running. So it's interesting to me that, this is now something that pretty much across the board politically, everyone's like, okay, yeah, no, we've got to do this. Do you think we've actually reached a turning point? Is there a chance that we backslide again and we don't do this, or are we pretty much over the hump now and this is just what the future of car making is going to look like?
Yeah, well, I'd say we've hit a little bit of a bump in the road, just a little one, and that has to do with Trump's approach to the electric vehicle supply chain, right? Like we were working in tandem with the US to build out a North American EV manufacturing sector and the associated supply chains. The Inflation Reduction Act that Biden announced that had all of the manufacturing credits and domestic content requirements for consumer purchase incentives were causing global car makers to redraw global supply chains at a rapid pace. And North America was quickly catching up to and surpassing even the EU when it came to some of our battery manufacturing capacity. That has now stalled. And, there are a lot of questions about what direction Canada's going to take on EVs, whether we follow the US in this backtrack and double downing on fossil fuels and gas-powered cars, both driving and manufacturing them, or whether we continue to go in the direction of the rest of the world. But I just want to backtrack and say, if we actually look at what Canada's auto sector opportunity is and economic opportunity is, it's in electric vehicles, not in gas powered. From 2000 to 2020, Canada's auto sector was in decline. We were losing jobs, losing investment, producing fewer vehicles. We in our heyday were the 5th largest auto manufacturer in the world, and we dropped down to the 12th. But then something happened when the EV transition really started to pick up. All of a sudden, we started winning, right? In 2021, Unifor struck a deal with Ford Motor Company to start building 5 EVs in its Oakville plant. That was followed by similar announcements from Stellantis to build EVs and batteries in Windsor, GM to build electric delivery vans in Ingersoll. We attracted a new entrant, Volkswagen, with a $7 billion investment in a battery plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. And then, of course, the biggest investment in Canada's auto history, Honda, $15 billion investment to build EVs and batteries in Ontario. So, within 3 years, we had $50 billion worth of investments announced. Canada rose to the top global ranks in terms of our EV battery supply chain potential. And you really, and then this isn't even counting all of the upstream activity this was stimulating in, like, as you say, critical mineral mines, battery materials. So in short, Canada's auto sector is much better placed to win in an all electric future than a gas powered one. And I really think politicians need to remember this, and some of them are, but there's a real temptation, especially with, the Detroit Big Three, US headquartered car makers pushing back, wanting to continue to squeeze more profit out of the old technology they've been building, for decades now. I think Canada's at a turning point of whether we want to double down on this opportunity or align with the US, who's going backwards.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, to draw out of that. One is, you're somebody who pays attention to the space. I'm sure you're reading the tea leaves. Where do you think we're going to go? Because I think there are really two questions here. One is regionality and one is trade. So the regionality piece is every plant you just mentioned is in Ontario. It's not in any other part of the country. And this has been part of the conversation in our trade war with the US is some parts of the economy are not feeling any pain on certain topics and other parts are feeling very different pain on other parts. So you can talk about like canola in Saskatchewan or the auto sector in Ontario. And there's very, very different pain points and it's not shared equally across the board. Do you think the fact that most of these jobs happen in Ontario actually harms the future of our auto sector because, it makes sense. There's the trade corridor there with Windsor and Detroit and all that kind of stuff. But does it actually, harm our collective interest in it as voters and as politicians who follow, voting wins? Is that something that will get in the way because not everybody is feeling the same pain? And then the other part is is EV something you think, from, being a watcher and political student yourself of what's going on in Ottawa, is that something that, may be on the table as we look at, renegotiating CUSMA in the next, year or two or whatever it is? I see those as two sort of challenges that create a bit of uncertainty in this space. Do you kind of feel the same?
Well, so when it comes to electric vehicles, that's where we have an opportunity to expand out of Ontario. If we double down on producing gas powered, then you're right. The jobs are very much concentrated in one province. But if we pursue this EV battery supply chain, all of a sudden, this is a pan-Canadian opportunity. Quebec, in many ways, was, out competing Ontario in attracting investments in critical minerals, battery material production, even battery plants at one point. In BC, you've got critical mineral opportunities, like copper that can feed into the supply chain. BC's also got a lot of leadership on battery recycling. Alberta is finding ways to extract lithium from like oil wastewater brine. Saskatchewan's got rare earths that can be mined to feed into EV magnets. And, that right now China is totally controlling the global supply chain on that. In Nova Scotia, over in Atlantic Canada, you've got one of the leading battery researchers at Dalhousie that's really leading the way. So I think this is an argument in favor of building out our EV battery supply chain, is then we're getting all of Canada in on this opportunity instead of just one central province. But you're right. In present day, when it comes to the trade and tariff talks, we are seeing a bit of provinces and their industries being pit against each other, and I'm curious where that will go. I certainly think there are many reasons to revisit the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, our trade relationship with China, and our national unity being two of them.
Right, definitely. Well, you've definitely sold the pan-Canadian element to it. So I want to pivot and talk a little bit about that, because the Carney government had a bit of a whirlwind session in the spring where they came back and passed a bunch of legislation. One of them was Bill 5, which was basically about really, really quickly building out these national projects across the country that were going to sort of kick our economy into high gear and really get all of us rowing sort of in the same direction. Now, there are a number of problems with that, which is the approach anytime you put in sort of omnibus legislation that sort of gets passed really, really quickly without a lot of consultation, is that, one, it leaves a lot of people out, but two, there's a lot of critical things that can be left out too when you're just moving that quickly. So, this legislation and this sort of Build Canada project in general has a few complications. So one is with existing Indigenous rights. One is, the impact that the extraction and processing process has on the environment and our climate progress, of course. And then, the other part, as we start to build more EVs, is that there's an increased demand for electricity, which, as somebody who's concerned about AI as well, I'm like, ooh, the grid is in trouble if we don't increase capacity. So there's all these different components that come into these conversations, and you may want to, hit the gas. Well, maybe not hit the gas, hit the battery, I guess is the better expression here. Fully down hard and really get moving on these things. But there are some components that we have to think about. So when it comes to EV, and I know people have said this with like the batteries, they're like, well, is it really better than gas because you have these minerals and you have to recycle and da-da-da-da-da. And we know across the supply chain and the recycling process, it is actually still better for the climate than a gas-powered vehicle. But given, some of these concerns, how can we make sure EV supply chains, as we sort of gear up to make them even bigger in Canada, how can we make sure they're environmentally sustainable, socially responsible, and also respect Indigenous rights?
Yeah. When we're talking about shifting to EVs, this is really sort of like an auto 2.0, right? We have a chance to, as we're transitioning this industry, we have a chance to do things right this time around. And
what an idea.
And you're right. And like, there are still risks, of course, but I think many of these can be minimized or offset with a thoughtful and forward-looking approach. So on mining, it's true that EVs do require more metals and minerals than gas cars do. From a carbon pollution standpoint, even when you take into account those mining emissions, for sure, EVs are still the lower polluters, especially in Canada, plugging into our electricity grid. But mining can absolutely have significant impacts on the environment and surrounding communities, including Indigenous communities. So I think we need to recognize this and address those needs head on. So first and foremost, we need to ensure mining projects meet the highest environmental, social, and governance standards. And this includes respecting the rights of Indigenous communities, proactively engaging them, ideally identifying opportunities for partnerships, Indigenous-led ventures in the battery supply chain, equity ownership opportunities. I think it's important to say not all critical mineral reserves should be developed. You know, if we don't have willing partners and if the risks outweigh the benefits, we can say no. Like, that's what the process is for. And speeding through, using legislation like Bill C5 definitely makes it harder to bake in time to identify and weigh those risks. And so we've got to make sure we're doing this right. But we can say no. Sometimes it's not the right decision. We should also be electrifying our mining sites wherever possible and running them on Canada's clean electricity. In the first tranche of projects of national interest that were announced last week or the week before, we were pleased to see a focus on electrifying the mining projects, and that's got to be a key goal. And then the other thing is battery recycling. So what's also great about EVs and critical minerals is critical minerals are highly recyclable. We have technology that can recover up to 95% of the battery materials at the end of an EV battery's life and reintroduce them into the supply chain. Canadian companies are leading the way on this. We've got like Li-Cycle in Kingston, Ontario, and a couple of other companies in Quebec, BC, and Ontario. And so, we've got to be building these supply chains, including recycling from the start. And I should say, oil and gas cars, they don't have that same opportunity. You burn the gas and then it's gone. There's no recycling it. And so another way that
Right.
EVs are more sustainable. Then on the electricity grid, it's actually often overstated what impact increasing EV uptake will have on our grid. I think there is a lot of fear around this, but a federal government study shows that in 2030, EVs are going to make up 3% of electricity demand, and that's still a ways away. By 2050, that does rise to about 23%, but that gives electric utilities 25 years to plan and invest and get ready. And many of them are getting out ahead of this. They're offering their own charging networks like the Ivy network in Ontario or like BC Hydro, Hydro-Quebec. They're taking an active role here. Some are also offering lower off-peak electricity rates to incentivize EV drivers to charge at times of lower electricity demand, like overnight. Ontario has a super cheap ultra overnight electricity rate of like 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour. It would cost me $1.79 to fully charge my EV in Ontario if I did so overnight. And so that reduces the need for extra capacity. EV batteries actually can help stabilize the grid, that the vehicle to grid technology is advancing. And so you see stories of a, Ford F-150 Lightning owner being able to power their home for 3 days in an outage. So we can leverage these for good. And then I guess last thing I'll say is one of the best things that we can do to help electric utilities plan in this way is maintaining that EV availability standard, the EV sales regulation, because it gives them a very clear sense of how many EVs can they expect to be sold and added to Canadian roads year after year. And then they are able to go and integrate those targets into their demand projections and plan. Before that policy was in place, electric utilities were shooting in the dark. They weren't motivated to get out ahead of this. So that's one of the many reasons that that policy that's really been in the news lately is actually a good thing that's going to help us prepare in the right ways.
Something, I think that EV advocates can actually steal from the oil sector is, there's that concept of ethical oil, right? And how the last barrel needs to come from Canada. And I'm like, well, if we keep trying to get the last barrel, we're probably not going to stop. There's all of that. But there might be an argument to ethical EVs. So, when we think of mining that is done in South America or Africa or wherever, we don't have the same labor standards and practices that we have here in Canada. We don't have the same standards around, waste and how it's dealt with afterwards and all these kinds of things. So is there, sort of, an ethical moral argument we should be making too, that like, if you want a really great EV in terms of the technology and the craftsmanship and the resources that go into it, should we not be arguing also, like Canada is the place to get a really, really good EV that, like throughout the process is going to be manufactured in the most ethical way of anyone out there doing it right now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's our competitive advantage, right? We've got the clean electricity grid. We've got mining projects that meet higher environmental, social, and governance standards. We used to always say, even if Canada can't compete with China on cost, we can compete with China on clean by offering this sort of ethical EV. And there are ways to ensure that that sort of thing is happening. So the EU, for instance, has a battery regulation. It sets standards for the carbon footprint of the batteries and is encouraging batteries to be manufactured by plugging into electricity grids versus being run on natural gas. It also has standards around, responsible sourcing of the critical minerals that feed into the batteries. And then private sector companies have that too. Certain car companies have carbon neutral goals, which, looks to reduce carbon emissions across their entire supply chain. Some have responsible sourcing protocols as well, where they won't, source cobalt from countries that don't meet certain environmental and labor standards. I can't say I know the status of some of those private sector led, protocols at this stage when ESG is getting attacked on all fronts, but there are certainly efforts to clean up supply chains and do things right. And there's also innovation that's happening. So cobalt, 80 or 90% of global cobalt comes from the DRC. And that's not, lots of things that are going on there that, we don't want to support. Yeah. But because there's limited supply of cobalt coming from other places, car companies are investing in battery technology or batteries that don't use cobalt. They're moving away from it. They're using more nickel based batteries or iron phosphate. They're looking for critical inputs that are in greater supply and that can be sourced from places that are able to meet those higher standards.
It's something I think about all the time. Like, I studied philosophy in university, so I spent a lot of time in ethics classes. So it's something I think about in general, but also when I was at the Ministry of Agriculture, this was a conversation we had about shrimp, which you're like, okay. But, in Canada, we actually can do deep water shrimp in our very cold Great Lakes. Whereas normally you would do shrimp farming in the ocean, but in a lot of places, most shrimp that you get externally from Canada is collected through slave labor. And these are things to think about when we're talking about other places that we're getting products and whether it makes sense to really build up our own industries, even just, from our own ethical well-being and feeling okay about the purchases we're making and the decisions we're making as a country. You mentioned China, and I want to talk about China. So this is the big conversation right now. We're in a protectionist moment in general, but at the same time, there are a lot of negotiations happening with Europe, with other places around the world. We are trying to expand into different markets with different partners. So there's a little bit of a mix going on right now. And I think the big conversation around EVs right now is, do we want to balance building up our own industries in Canada around the space, or do we also at the same time want to make sure that Canadian consumers can actually afford EVs? So, we've seen the EV market essentially crash. Hybrids are going up. I think there's like 30%. I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was like 30% fewer EVs sold in the last, like, however long it was. You'll know better than me, but there's definitely a bit of a crash happening, and a lot of that is because the incentives are disappearing from government. So we saw this in Quebec, we've seen this in other places. A lot of that is what is cratering the market. Having said that, we also have just like an affordability crisis happening in general, and it is really, really difficult when people are making these, other than their homes, the biggest purchases they make in their life. And it's a question between, this car over here that I can afford, maybe it's a hybrid, maybe it's not a full gas car, whatever, but I can't get a full EV, so I'm going to go with this. But we were talking, before we hit record, about if you want people to adopt climate-friendly solutions, they need to be affordable. And for them to be affordable, that might mean they can't always come from Canada, as we're sort of going through our growing pains of growing back up our market and becoming competitive on a global scale, which, enters into the chat China, because China is doing a lot of work in this space. China has spent a lot of time in the last, 20 years really greening their manufacturing capacity. Now, some of it's run off of coal, so how green is it? All that kind of stuff. We'll take all that. But we do have to balance this sort of conversation between affordability and climate friendliness. So what do you think about opening the door to Chinese EVs? Is this something that's going to, decimate our own sector? Is this something that we sort of have to do in the meantime, before, as we grow and get more competitive? Where's your thinking on this? Because I think there's a lot of different viewpoints out there right now on this topic.
Absolutely. I have to say, this is one of the most complicated topics that I have ever worked on. The delicate and tricky balance that government has to strike, as you say, between protecting our domestic industry and then trying to prioritize EVs that Canadians can afford, not to mention trade relations between, two elephants of the US and China.
It makes you really want to go out and run for office, right?
Yeah. I feel for the federal government, this is a difficult topic to navigate. So yeah, as you mentioned, China is a leader on EVs. They got a multi-decade head start. The country's invested heavily in its industry and battery technology, and has played a key role driving global battery prices down. Battery prices have dropped 90% in the last 10 years, and this is largely due to China. Ideally, those drops in cost would be something that global automakers and Canadian consumers could benefit from, but geopolitics. So last year,
I'm going to make that like a button, but geopolitics.
So last year, the federal government decided to follow the US in applying an 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, or Chinese-made EVs. As a result, there are pretty much none here in Canada. Now, we watched closely, and the EU took a different approach. They conducted a detailed investigation of each car maker. They went out to see what level of subsidization from the Chinese government did each car maker actually receive. And then they set company-specific tariffs on those car makers and their vehicles to level the playing field for domestic EU car makers. Those tariffs range from about 8 to 35%. Compared to our 100%. Now, we think this was an interesting approach that perhaps did a better job balancing those goals of protecting domestic industry while prioritizing affordable EVs for consumers. So if you look at what happened with the EU, now some Chinese EVs have entered into the market. many of them are more affordable. We actually put out a report today that found the EU currently has 21 EV models available under the price point of $40,000 Canadian. 21. In Canada, we have one. Now, how Chinese EVs factored into this was not exactly what you think. There are fears that, Chinese EVs are going to come in and take over the markets, but that's not how it's played out. In most EU countries, Chinese EVs make up less than 10% of sales. Of that 21, or of those 21 more affordable EV models in the EU, only 7 are Chinese made. Many of them are being offered by European automakers because the presence of Chinese EVs brought in some healthy competition and forced them to step up their game and start offering or prioritizing more affordable models that, can get into or speak to the mainstream car market. So this is interesting to us. This is something that we think Canada could learn from. And it would better balance that, protecting the domestic industry with making sure that Canadians can get their hands on an affordable EV. Like, Canadians know that they can save a lot of money driving an EV. Our research shows you save about $3,000 a year if you buy, and drive an electric car versus a comparable gas car, which translates to like $30,000 over the course of the vehicle's life. But the upfront cost is still too high. And it's because we don't have any affordable EV models available here in Canada. The Detroit Big Three and even really Honda and Toyota, the ones who are, offering cars into the North American market, they don't have plans to. And so, this is a gap that needs to be filled. And yeah, when it comes to Canadian jobs and industry, I think there are other ways to explore further protecting them. So lower the tariff, let in some competition, but you could do things like have a quota on how many Chinese EVs get to come in, have a price floor or, a price ceiling. There are different ways to do it. You could also even attach strings and say, we'll only waive tariffs for Chinese companies that invest in Canada and employ Canadian workers, agree to purchase and use Canadian inputs, whether it's critical minerals or battery materials. And you can even put in some conditions around like knowledge, skills, and technology transfer, national security provisions. There's a way to do this where we can sort of enjoy the benefits and stoke some much needed competition in Canada's car market. We have an uncompetitive car market where the average price of a new car is $67,000 now. But also create that space to help our industry set itself up to compete and thrive like long into the future.
I think it's really interesting because when people think of China, they think of two things. There's a lack of competition and that labor standards are terrible. And therefore, that's why you can produce a car cheaply. But adding in the European example there of the competition that happened because of the Chinese vehicles coming in, it's really, really interesting because obviously, I don't know that Canada's labor standards are better than Europe's, for example. So it does give a lot of food for thought of, hey, this actually could be possible in our market as well. I want to briefly talk about used EVs. So we're now sort of into the life cycle of vehicles that are electric being actually old at this point because we've been doing this for a while now. And, as you know, over the lifetime of people buying cars, about 80% of Canadians actually do buy a used car at some point in their life, which is an enormous number. It means almost all Canadians, get a used car at some point. My parents have always been new people, but they're the other 20%. So given that fact, how important is it to create a bit of an aftermarket for EV users? There's the early adopters who will always come in and get the newest, latest thing, but that does create opportunities for an actual used EV market. What kind of policy can government put forward to help encourage this? And how can we really get that off the ground? Because it also does speak to affordability, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I think there's so much focus on new vehicles, but that's not where the majority of Canadians are at. So I'd start by saying the best way to grow the used EV market is by incentivizing new EVs into Canada. If you look at BC as an example, they've had a historically very high EV adoption rate. but that's resulted in a really robust used market. You can now buy EVs with over 400 kilometers at a price point of like $20,000 in BC, which really opens up electric cars and the fuel cost savings they provide to this whole new category of buyers. But there are other policies besides incentivizing new EVs that governments can offer. So you can offer incentives for used EVs. Many provinces in Canada actually do. Most provinces that have an incentive for new also offer an incentive for used. And they're quite popular, but they don't get that much attention, these incentives. Another sort of less sexy way to incentivize the purchase of used EVs is by making battery health testing more of a standard practice. It's funny because, you know, you hear about barriers to EV adoption being purchase price, charging infrastructure. One of the biggest ones that we see is this perceived worry that your battery is going to conk out and you'll be on the hook to replace it, which can be expensive. In reality, this is incredibly rare. You know, in studies of tens of thousands of EVs on the road, 2% of EV batteries end up breaking down before the end of the vehicle life. But this often happens when the battery is still under warranty anyways. Ensuring that dealerships kind of test and report out on the battery health of used vehicles, I think would actually be a pretty low-hanging fruit policy that nobody's going to argue with, that would offer much needed comfort to buyers who are worried about this. I've owned 2 EVs and in my life. I got them both used. It's a way more affordable option. And then you just get to reap the long-term cost benefit savings that EVs provide, where across Canada, it costs $5 to $15 to fully charge an electric SUV.
What, not to get too personal, but how much did you pay for those used vehicles? Because you were talking earlier about the cost savings that you have of an EV over the course of its life. And you were saying, you buy it for about you can buy it for 40 and you get about 30 grand back. And I'm like, that's basically a free car at this point. So when it's used, presumably it's even a better deal because you're presumably paying less upfront. About how much do you think it generally is?
Yeah, so the first vehicle I got was a used electric Kona. It was 2 years old, and I got it for $33,000. Still a hefty price that not everybody can pay, but right now most new EVs are in the range of 55 to 60. And then we recently sold our Kona and got a Volkswagen ID4, a used Volkswagen ID4. Again, I think it's 2 years old, and it was, I want to say $42,000. So, okay. Yeah, I'm someone who's committed to the cause, and I do know.
No, for sure, but at the same time, you're also taking off like a third, a quarter of the price each time that you do it used, which is nothing to snuff at in these times. I do want to ask about northern and rural communities, because this is always the concern that people say, well, I can't have a car in one of these communities that are more remote because there aren't enough charging stations. I worry about it freezing in the winter, yada, yada, yada. What do you say to those people in terms of whether this is something that's possible for them, and how can we help make sure that nobody's really left behind in that transition? Because, this is a big, cold country. There's a lot of remote communities. And eventually, if the goal is to get everybody into this space going forward, how do we make that possible?
Yeah. So first, I want to say, when it comes to concerns about the cold, it's true that EVs can be impacted by the cold, just like gas cars can be. How many times you get into your car in a winter morning, you can't start your car when it's a gas car. But battery technology, like thermal management systems, are getting better and better. And many EVs now come with heat pumps. And so that's becoming less and less of a concern. In terms of, I think one thing to just tackle as well is I think there is a lot of confusion around how easy or hard it is to adopt an electric vehicle in a more rural area. And 80 or 90% of charging an EV happens at home. often in rural areas, they're mostly populated by single family homes where it's really easy to plug in or install a charger if you need to, unlike, big condos or apartment buildings in downtown cores. And so for many folks living in rural areas, charging is not going to be an issue unless you're doing, super long, over 400-kilometer commutes every day, because most EVs come with a range of over 450 kilometers now. But for sure, there are specific barriers to adoption in those regions, especially when drivers have long daily commutes. And I'd say there are like two main solutions that are available and that we're focusing on. One, federal and provincial governments do have charging funding programs that support the installation of public charging stations. Those government programs should be targeting these harder to reach regions, especially because they're not likely going to be used that often. And so the business case doesn't pencil out as much for private sector investment, unlike, a dense urban city. And then the other thing is, even under the federal EV availability standard and provincial sales regulations, plug-in hybrids are allowed to be sold. Those are vehicles that still have a gas tank, but they also have a battery with an external plug. So if someone needed to run that vehicle entirely on gas, they could. And that offers, a backstop for someone who is afraid that they wouldn't be able to get to a charging station in time.
I think of it a lot like, like I was born in a very remote community. There are no roads that go to Moosonee. So, this is something that you think about in places like that. But it's similar to the broadband conversation that we've been having for, 15, 20 years across Canada, of how to connect communities in different ways. This will just become another question about how to connect communities in the future, I think. Before we go, I want to talk to you about, the broader green economy that is emerging around the world. So I think we're very much heading into that direction. Even Trump on some fronts is like, okay, I can see value in making money on things. So I think we're heading there. I think when you see more developing economies and more polluting economies making these transitions, that we're sort of on the way down that road, and China's all in on this, Europe's all in on this, Canada's increasingly all in on this. I think that's where we're headed. Something I want to talk about is, how can Canada, given that this is all really new and no, we're all sort of at the starting gate at this point, and there's an opportunity to really be a leader in the green economy going forward, to really take our place as, one of the top nations in this space. What are some of, it's a very broad question, but what are the characteristics that we need to be looking at? What are the priorities we need to be making to make sure that we are really competitive in this space going forward?
Yeah. So I think, Canada is really at this pivotal moment right now in deciding what kind of Canada do we want to be, what kind of economy do we want to build, especially as we're needing to rethink our trading partnership with the U.S. And as the U.S. is sort of backsliding into more of a fossil fuel-based economy, we need to decide, are we going to go in that direction, or are we going to align with the rest of the world? Because globally, the clean economy is booming. Of the $3 trillion of energy-related investment that's expected for this year, $2 trillion of that is in clean energy, not conventional. Employment in clean energy has now, surpassed that of fossil fuels. And so this is really where the global opportunity is. We did a recent analysis looking at Canada's 10 largest non-US trading partners, and we found that all of them have net zero commitments and carbon pricing systems in place. Half of them have carbon border adjustments that prefer lower carbon goods coming into their markets. And then half of them also have domestic EV requirements that are reshaping their car markets and the oil and gas demand that, goes with that. So if we want to align with where the direction of the world is headed, then, we think clean equals competitive, and Canada's particularly well positioned to to seize this opportunity. We've got one of the cleanest electricity grids in the world. We've got the critical mineral resources that need to go into all of those clean energy technologies. We've got some other, we've got second highest ranked EV and battery supply chain in the world, high skilled workforce, leaders in innovation. And so there are so many competitive advantages that are not just oil and gas, that Canada has an opportunity right now to sort of double down on in all of our discussions related to breaking down internal trade barriers and deciding what national projects of national interest we're going to advance, and in deciding how we want to diversify our trading partnerships and figure out, what sorts of products and services we want to be offering those economies. It's a pivotal moment for Canada, and if we really want our economy to be competitive, not just today, but long into the future, focusing on the clean economy has to be a top priority.
Well, I think I've just had a masterclass on this topic from you. Like I've learned so much, and hopefully our listeners do too. It's been great having you on. Thank you so much, Joanna.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.